At 55, my ex-wife and her lawyer took everything, until my grandfather's hidden account made me rich again. I used to think that hard work and loyalty could protect you from heartbreak. I was wrong. My name is Mark Reynolds, and at 55 years old, I learned that a lifetime of effort can vanish in a single courtroom afternoon. For most of my adult life, I ran a small construction company in Southern California. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I started it when I was 27, fresh out of college with a business degree I'd earned while working nights at a lumber yard. One pickup truck, a toolbox inherited from my grandfather, and a determination to never ask anyone for handouts. That's how it began. By the time I hit 50, we were building custom homes along the coast between Ventura and Santa Barbara, employing almost 100 workers. I thought I had everything figured out. A steady business with contracts lined up 2 years in advance, a Spanish-style house in Ventura with an ocean view, and a wife, Linda, who had been with me since my early 30s. Linda had the kind of charm that made people lean in when she spoke. She could walk into any room, a client dinner, a neighborhood barbecue, a charity gala, and make everyone feel like they were the most important person there. In the beginning, back when we were scraping by and I was bidding on small bathroom renovations, she was my biggest supporter. She handled client calls from our tiny apartment, scheduled appointments in spiral notebook, and always told me she believed in what I was building. I trusted her completely. Looking back now, maybe that complete trust was my first mistake. Or maybe it was just the natural blind spot of a man who confused companionship with partnership. Around the time our 2 kids went off to college, Sarah to UC Davis and Michael to San Diego State, things started to shift. The change was subtle at first, the kind you explain away because acknowledging it feels too dangerous. I was busy expanding the company, taking on larger projects, spending long days on job sites and longer evenings going over blueprints and budgets. Linda said she felt lonely. She said the house felt empty without the kids. She said she needed something that was hers. I understood that, or at least I thought I did. I encouraged her to find something fulfilling. I was proud when she started volunteering at a legal aid center downtown, helping low-income families navigate small claims and tenant disputes. She said she wanted to help people find justice. I didn't know that one of the lawyers there, Ethan Cole, was about to systematically dismantle everything I'd spent 3 decades building. Ethan was 42, younger than both of us, with the kind of manufactured confidence that comes from winning cases you shouldn't have won. He wore expensive suits that looked effortless, drove a Tesla before they were everywhere, and had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When Linda first introduced him at a charity fundraiser for the Legal Aid Center, I shook his hand firmly, the way my grandfather taught me. He made jokes about how hard it must be to run a business, how guys like me were the backbone of California, keeping the economy moving while lawyers like him just shuffled papers. I laughed, bought a round of drinks, and thought nothing of it. I didn't know that same man would later file papers designed to strip me of everything I'd worked for. The affair started small, I imagine. Maybe it was just coffee after a long day at the center. Then dinners under the pretense of discussing cases. Then something more. I didn't see it coming because I was buried in work, and because after 25 years of marriage, you stop looking for betrayal. You assume the foundation is solid because it's held up this long. Linda spent more nights out, helping clients, she said. Her phone became a locked vault she carried everywhere. She grew distant over dinners, answering questions with single syllables while her fingers twitched toward her purse where her phone buzzed silently. I told myself it was menopause, empty nest syndrome, the natural drift of middle age. You tell yourself these things because the alternative, that your wife is planning to destroy you, is too horrifying to consider. The first real crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. My accountant, Jerry, who'd been with me for 15 years, called me while I was at a job site in Carpinteria. His voice was tight with panic. "Mark, did you authorize these withdrawals?" he asked. "What withdrawals?" I said, pulling off my work gloves. Over the next 20 minutes, standing in the skeleton frame of a half-built house, I learned that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been quietly moved from our joint accounts over the past 8 months. Linda had transferred the money in careful increments, never enough to trigger automatic alerts, always just below the reporting thresholds, into a trust registered under both her and Ethan's names. The trust was called Coastal Holdings LLC, registered in Nevada, deliberately opaque. I remember standing there after hanging up, the sun glaring through the unfinished walls, my chest tightening until I couldn't draw a full breath. My crew was hammering somewhere above me. A radio played classic rock. Everything felt suddenly unreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I drove home in the middle of the day, something I never did. The house was empty. Linda's car was gone. I went into our home office and started going through files, bank statements, anything I could find. The more I looked, the worse it got. She'd been planning this for almost a year. When she came home that evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table with printouts spread in front of me. She stopped in the doorway, saw my face, saw the papers, and something in her expression shifted. Not guilt exactly. More like resignation, like an actress finally allowed to drop an exhausting role. "We need to talk," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. She set down her purse slowly, carefully, and sat across from me. I asked her why. I asked her how long she'd been planning this. I asked her if any of the last 25 years had been real. She didn't answer most of it. She just looked tired and said, "I deserve happiness too, Mark. You've been married to your business for years. I was just the person who kept your house running." That sentence lodged itself in my chest like a piece of shrapnel. The next morning, a process server came to the job site and handed me divorce papers, filed by Ethan Cole, Esquire. The following 8 months blurred into an endless nightmare of court hearings, depositions, and legal maneuvering. Ethan represented Linda, and he was good at his job. He knew every trick, every procedural loophole, every way to make an honest man look guilty. He painted me as a controlling husband who'd isolated Linda, who'd hidden money in offshore accounts, who'd run the business like a tyrant while she suffered in silence. None of it was true, but truth is a surprisingly weak defense when your opponent is willing to lie with documents. They produced financial records I'd never seen, fake statements showing wire transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands. They brought forward a former employee I'd fired for stealing materials, who suddenly claimed I'd threatened him. They made Linda cry on the stand while describing how lonely and afraid she'd been. My lawyer, a competent but overworked public attorney named Patricia Davis, tried to fight back, but we were outgunned. Ethan's firm had resources we couldn't match, and he deployed them ruthlessly. I watched decades of work evaporate in a courtroom in downtown Ventura. Judge Harold Simmons, a tired-looking man in his 60s who seemed to just want everyone to settle, awarded Linda the house, 51% ownership of my company, and most of our savings. The company's stake was the cruelest cut. She'd never shown interest in the business, never visited a job site, never even asked about projects. But California is a community property state, and Ethan had convinced the judge that her emotional labor and support had been essential to the business's success. Even my truck, a 2015 Ford F-250 I'd bought used to maintain myself, was listed as a shared marital asset. By the end, after legal fees and settlements, I was allowed to keep a single property, an old cabin my grandfather had left me in the hills north of Ojai, about 40 minutes inland. Linda didn't want it. During negotiations, Ethan had actually laughed and said, "She's not interested in that shack." The contempt in his voice was almost refreshing in its honesty. I left the courthouse that day carrying a cardboard box containing printouts of the final judgment, some personal photos Patricia had retrieved for me, and a framed picture of my grandfather that had been on my office desk. The Santa Ana winds were blowing hot and dry, carrying the smell of sage and distant wildfires. I drove north into the hills as the sun set, watching Ventura disappear in my rearview mirror. Some friends sent short text messages, "Hang in there, buddy, and this is temporary." Others said nothing. In business, I learned, once you look weak, people move on. Clients I'd known for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts when I called. Suppliers who'd extended me credit for decades wanted payment up front. The construction world is small, and word travels fast. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained. It was small, maybe 800 square feet, with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with appliances from the 1970s, and a porch that sagged on one side. The roof leaked in 3 places. The plumbing groaned and rattled. At night, coyotes howled in the chaparral, and owls called each other in the oak trees. I fixed what I could with the tools I'd managed to keep. I patched the roof with spare shingles I found in the shed. I replaced washers in the faucets. I spent my days doing small repairs and my nights sitting by the fireplace, working through a bottle of cheap whiskey I bought at the general store in town. There were nights, more than I care to count, when I stared into those flames and thought about disappearing. Not suicide exactly, but something close. Just walking into the hills and letting the wilderness take me. Becoming one of those stories people tell about hermits who vanish into the mountains. The pain wasn't sharp anymore. It had settled into a dull, constant ache that colored everything gray. I'd wake up and forget for a moment, think about heading to the job site, then remember I didn't have a job site anymore. I'd reach for my phone to call Linda about something mundane, then remember she'd betrayed me so thoroughly that our entire marriage now felt like a lie I'd told myself. But every time I reached that edge, staring into the darkness beyond the porch with the whiskey making my thoughts loose and dangerous, I'd hear my grandfather's voice. Not literally, I'm not claiming I was hallucinating. But the memory of his voice, the cadence and tone of it, echoing in my mind, when life burns you, boy, don't run from a fire. Learn what it's trying to teach you. He'd told me that when I was 17 and had lost a wrestling match, I'd been sure I'd win. He'd said it again when my first business attempt, a landscaping service, had failed because my partner had stolen our equipment and disappeared. My grandfather, Samuel Reynolds, had been the only real father figure I'd ever known. My own dad had left when I was 10, just walked out one afternoon, and never came back. Grandpa Reynolds had stepped in without fanfare, teaching me how to use tools, how to negotiate, how to look people in the eye when shaking hands. He'd worked as a machinist his whole life at a factory in Oxnard, never wealthy, but proud of every dollar he earned honestly. When he died in 1996, right before Christmas, he'd left me that cabin and an old bank passbook tucked into his Bible with a note that said, "For when you need it." I'd glanced at the passbook once back then, First California Savings Bank, some tiny balance from 1950, and stored it away, thinking it was just a sentimental keepsake. I'd forgotten about it entirely until one rainy afternoon in late October, about 7 months after the divorce was finalized. A storm had rolled in from the Pacific, knocking out power to the cabin. I was sorting through cardboard boxes by flashlight, trying to organize what was left of my life, when a faded blue booklet fell onto the floor. The cover was cracked and water-stained, the embossed lettering nearly worn away. I picked it up, recognizing it slowly. First California Savings Bank. Account holder, Samuel J. Reynolds. I flipped it open. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten entries in careful cursive. The last entry, dated April 3rd, 1950, showed a balance of $312.18. I sat there on the floor, rain drumming on the roof, staring at that number. $312.18 from 75 years ago. I almost threw it into the fireplace. What was the point? The bank probably didn't even exist anymore. But something stopped my hand, maybe curiosity, maybe the desperate hope that some tiny piece of my grandfather's life could still matter. The next morning, after the storm passed, I drove down to Ventura to see if the bank still existed. First California Savings had been absorbed by a larger regional bank in the 1980s, which itself had been bought by an even larger national chain. But the accounts had been preserved through each merger. I found this out from a young teller named Amanda, who looked about 25, with neat braids and professional enthusiasm. I handed her the passbook, feeling foolish. She scanned the account number, 1029-47, into her computer and frowned. "Sir, this is really old. Let me get my manager." An older man emerged from a back office a few minutes later, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses. His nameplate read Thomas Chun, branch manager. "Mr. Reynolds," he said, extending his hand. "Could we speak privately?" He led me into a small office with a window overlooking the parking lot. I sat in a chair that wheezed under my weight while he settled behind his desk and typed carefully into his computer, squinting at the screen. The silence stretched. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't read. "Mr. Reynolds, this account has been continuously active since 1950. It's never been closed. May I see your identification?" I handed him my driver's license. He examined it, compared it to something on his screen, and typed more. The keyboard clicking seemed impossibly loud. "Sir," he said finally, clearing his throat, "due to accumulated compound interest over 75 years, the current balance is substantial." I leaned forward, my heart starting to pound. "How substantial are we talking?" He hesitated, then turned his monitor slightly so I could see. The number seemed to float on the screen, refusing to resolve into meaning. $98,426,781.29. $98,426,781.29. For a moment, the world went completely silent. I could see Mr. Chen's lips moving, but couldn't hear the words. The office seemed to tilt. I gripped the arms of the chair, convinced this was a mistake, a computer error, some cosmic joke. Mr. Chen opened a drawer and withdrew a thin manila envelope sealed with the bank's emblem and covered in official stamps and signatures. "This was left with the account instructions," he said quietly, sliding it across the desk. "You're the only authorized heir." My hand shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, the handwriting instantly recognizable despite being faded with age. My grandfather's distinctive scrawl, slightly shaky even back then. "Mark, if this ever reaches you, it means life has tested you hard." I put away a little money every week for years, always thinking maybe someday it could help you start something good. I never touched it because I didn't need it. I had enough, and what I had was earned honest. Remember what I taught you. Honor is worth more than gold. Money without honor is just paper that burns. If you've lost everything, let this be your new beginning. Don't let greed guide you like it guides small men. Build again, but build wisely. Build something that helps people. Don't waste this on revenge or bitterness. Life's too short for that poison. Make me proud, boy. Grandpa, April 1950. I sat in that office for nearly an hour, reading that letter over and over until the words blurred through my tears. Mr. Chen quietly brought me water and left me alone. My grandfather had been 28 when he wrote this, not much older than I'd been when I started my company. He'd put away money during a time when $300 was several months' wages, and he'd left it untouched for me. Through the Depression and World War II, and the Korean War, through marriages and raising my father, and then raising me, through all of it, he'd kept this account as a safety net for a grandson who hadn't even been born yet when he started. The next several weeks passed in a surreal haze of legal verifications, identity confirmations, and financial consultations. The bank's legal team worked with the state attorneys to establish the chain of inheritance. The account was legitimate, the compound interest calculated correctly, the documentation in order. Once everything was verified, the funds were transferred into a new account I opened under a private trust. For the first time in almost a year, I could breathe without my chest aching. But I didn't rush out to buy anything. I didn't call my kids to tell them. I didn't make any big gestures. Instead, I sat in the cabin and thought about what my grandfather had written, "Build wisely." I hired a financial advisor through recommendation from Mr. Chen. His name was Robert Martinez, a soft-spoken man in his mid-60s who worked independently rather than for a big firm. We met at a coffee shop in Ojai, and I told him everything, the betrayal, the forged documents, the court case, the way Ethan had systematically destroyed me. Robert listened without interrupting, taking occasional notes in a leather notebook. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't need revenge, Mark. You need truth. Revenge is about making yourself feel better. Truth is about making things right." That distinction mattered. Over the next several months, working with Robert's guidance, I hired a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Wong. She had a PhD in financial analysis and had worked with the FBI on fraud cases. I gave her access to everything, my bank records, the trust documents Ethan had created, the financial statements presented in court. She worked slowly and meticulously, following money trails the way a bloodhound follows scent. What she found was worse than I'd imagined. Ethan Cole had been running a scheme for at least 6 years. He specialized in high-asset divorces, and he had a pattern. He'd identify clients, usually women in troubled marriages, and cultivate relationships with them. Once he had their trust, he'd help them move marital assets into shell trusts and offshore accounts, falsify financial records to hide the movements, then represent them in divorce proceedings, where he'd use the forged documents to paint their husbands as hiding money. The husbands, already disadvantaged by incomplete financial pictures, would lose major assets. Ethan would take substantial legal fees plus percentages of settlements, and often the women he'd represented would later realize their money had also been siphoned away. Linda's case was just one of at least 15 similar cases Dr. Wong identified. Some of his victims had lost everything. One man had committed suicide. We compiled everything into a detailed report with exhibits and supporting documentation. Robert introduced me to a retired appellate judge named Margaret Holloway, who now worked as a legal consultant. She reviewed our evidence over a weekend, then called me on Monday morning. "If this reaches the district attorney," she said, "Ethan Cole is finished. This is criminal fraud, perjury, conspiracy to defraud, possibly racketeering under RICO. He's looking at serious prison time." Even with all of this, I didn't rush. I'd learned patience the hard way. We spent 3 more months collecting additional evidence, interviewing other victims, building an airtight case. When we finally handed everything to the Ventura County District Attorney's office in March, 2 years after my divorce had been finalized, they acted quickly. A grand jury was convened. Indictments were issued. One morning in early April, I was sitting on the cabin's porch with coffee, watching the sunrise paint the hills orange, when my phone buzzed with a news alert: prominent family law attorney Ethan Cole arrested on multiple fraud charges. I opened the article and read it slowly. Ethan had been arrested at his office. The charges included fraud, forgery, perjury, money laundering, and conspiracy. The article mentioned that an unnamed source had provided extensive documentation to prosecutors. Linda's name appeared in the third paragraph, charged as an accomplice in the scheme, facing her own potential prison time for conspiracy and perjury. I didn't cheer. I didn't feel triumphant. I just sat there with my coffee, watching the sun climb higher, listening to the birds wake up in the oak trees. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about finally being able to exhale without pain. The legal process ground forward with bureaucratic slowness. Ethan was disbarred within 3 months. His trial took a year, during which more victims came forward. He was eventually convicted on 12 counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Linda took a plea deal: 5 years probation, restitution, and permanent prohibition from filing any lawsuit without judicial approval. The civil suits came next. My divorce judgment was vacated based on the fraudulent evidence. My assets were legally restored. The company, which had been running under temporary management appointed by the court, was returned to my control. But I didn't go back to running it. I'd learned something during those months in the cabin, sitting by the fire and thinking about my grandfather's letter. I'd been so focused on building a business that I'd missed the point. The business was supposed to be a means to a life, not the life itself. I'd sacrificed my marriage. Not that Linda didn't share blame, but I'd been absent in ways that mattered and missed years with my kids chasing contracts and expansion. I didn't want that anymore. I sold 60% of the company to my former project manager, a good man named Rafael Ortiz, who'd stuck with me even during the worst of it. I kept 40% as a silent partner, enough to provide steady income without requiring my daily involvement. With part of the money from the sale and the inheritance from my grandfather, I established something new: the Reynolds Justice Trust, a nonprofit foundation that provides free legal assistance and financial support to people who've been victims of fraudulent divorces or corrupt legal practices. We started small, working out of a rented office in Ventura with 2 lawyers and a paralegal. In the first year, we helped 12 people, providing them with forensic accountants, honest lawyers, and enough financial support to survive while their cases were fought. One was a man named David Chun who'd lost his restaurant to his ex-wife and her attorney in a case eerily similar to mine. Another was a woman named Patricia Torres whose husband's lawyer had forged her signature on quitclaim deeds. We helped them get justice. It didn't undo what had happened to them, but it gave them a fighting chance to rebuild. My kids, Sarah and Michael, came to visit once they learned everything. They'd been confused and hurt by the divorce, unsure who to believe. When the truth came out about Ethan and their mother, they were devastated. Sarah cried in my arms on the cabin's porch, apologizing for believing Linda's version of events. I told her it wasn't her fault. Children shouldn't have to be investigators in their parents' wars. Michael, quieter and more reserved, just sat with me by the fire and didn't say much. But he came back the next weekend, and the one after that, and slowly we rebuilt something real. People sometimes ask me why I don't press for harsher punishment against Linda. The truth is, justice already did its work. She lost everything too: her reputation, her freedom, her relationship with our kids. She lives somewhere up north now, I've heard, working a retail job under a cloud of permanent shame. I don't hate her anymore. Hate takes energy I don't have. Mostly, I feel nothing when I think about her, which is its own kind of closure. Every morning now, I walk the beach near my new place in Ventura, a modest condo, nothing fancy, close enough to hear the waves at night. The ocean smells like salt and second chances. I often carry my grandfather's letter in my pocket, the paper soft and worn from being folded and unfolded so many times. When the wind picks up and the gulls cry overhead, I whisper, "You were right, Grandpa. I build again. This time wisely." The waves never answer, of course, but their sound is enough. There's a rhythm to them, constant and forgiving, that reminds me life continues whether we're ready or not. I'm 58 now, 3 years past the worst day of my life, and I'm building something that matters. Not a business empire. Not wealth for wealth's sake. Something my grandfather would recognize. Honest work that helps people who need it. That's worth more than any mansion, any fleet of trucks, any courthouse victory. It's worth more than revenge. It's worth more than bitterness. It's the difference between money and wealth, between success and meaning. My grandfather understood that when he wrote that letter 75 years ago, and I finally understand it now. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what we receive, but what we do with it once we have it. Please like, comment, and share. If this is your first time watching my video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you'll be notified whenever I post a new story.